So, we're going to dive into a pretty challenging theological argument today. It's one that really questions a core part of modern pastoral care. The whole thing comes from a set of documents arguing there's this huge imbalance in how the church holds people accountable.
And right from the jump, the source material does not pull any punches. It kicks off with this really provocative question. It frames the whole thing in medical terms, asking if the church is basically committing spiritual malpractice by treating men and women differently. I mean, that's a bold claim, so let's unpack what's behind it.
And really, this is the core idea: asymmetrical accountability. The argument goes like this. There's this widespread habit of calling out sins, typically associated with men, while, at the same time, totally downplaying or even ignoring the sins more common among women. And this imbalance, the source says, is nothing less than a critical failure. So, to build this case, the argument kicks off with a diagnosis, and it uses this really powerful medical analogy, framing sin as a universal disease, a spiritual condition that affects every single one of us. The foundation for all of this is a pretty classic theological concept: universal depravity. The source points to Scripture to establish that sin is basically an equal opportunity problem. There's no immunity clause you get based on your gender. The main idea here is that the spiritual disease itself is identical for everyone. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. The source claims that while the disease is the same for everybody, the symptoms often show up in gender-coded ways. For men, it often looks like a quest for dominance, physical, financial, or sexual. But for women, it's often a quest for control, just through different means, like social manipulation or materialism. The key point is that both are just symptoms of the exact same underlying condition. And this quote just brilliantly lays out the goal. The source is calling for a move away from these really simplistic, one-dimensional stereotypes. You see, it's arguing against this simple framework where men are always the villains who need to be broken and women are always the victims who just need to be comforted. It suggests, instead, that both are moral agents, fully capable of sin.
Okay, so the argument keeps building, and now it brings in a second metaphor: economics. It suggests that a lot of sins today operate just like a market, with these reciprocal transactions that are based on supply and demand.
Let's take sexuality, for example. The source argues that while the church often comes down hard on the male consumer, the act of objectification, it frequently turns a blind eye to the female solicitor. It points to things like intentional immodesty or what we'd call thirst traps online as active participation in this transaction. The argument is it's just not consistent to only address the demand side of this little economy.
And the exact same logic gets applied to power dynamics. The source contrasts that overt, obvious power, like tyranny, which is easy to spot and preach against, with covert power. And it defines this as relational aggression. We're talking about gossip, social exclusion, or emotional manipulation used to control people. The argument is that a pastor who only addresses one side of that equation is missing half the problem.
So if this imbalance is real, then why on earth is it happening? Well, the source suggests the reason isn't really theological ignorance. It's more about institutional pressure that forces church leaders into this tough choice. Are you going to be a prophet, or are you going to be a politician? And here is the absolute core of that pressure, summed up in what the source calls the salesman fallacy. It's this idea that when a church starts seeing its people as customers, the primary goal shifts. It's no longer about spiritual health, making them holy. It's about customer satisfaction, just keeping them happy. And this table, wow, it really lays out the two approaches in stark contrast. The prophet is motivated by a fear of God and calls out sin wherever it's found. But the politician, they're motivated by a fear of offending a key demographic. And since women often make up the majority of active church members, the source argues that pastors avoid addressing their specific sins because it feels like a bad business move. And the result is a safe space where certain sins are just allowed to grow. All right, so what's the solution? The source proposes a really radical reframing of the whole issue, to start seeing accountability not as a punishment, but as an incredible act of dignity and respect. This quote right here is the heart of the proposed cure. The argument is that refusing to hold women accountable is actually deeply patronizing. It implies they aren't strong enough to handle biblical truth, or that they aren't full moral agents. So, holding them accountable becomes an act of honoring their spiritual maturity. And the source even anticipates a common counter-argument, this Adam first idea. It pushes back by pointing out that, hey, in Genesis, God held Eve directly responsible for her actions. He asked her, "What is this that you have done?"
And then you look at the New Testament, and the story of Sapphira shows a woman being held individually accountable for her own sin, totally separate from her husband. So all of this builds up to a really clear 4-step resolution. The basic idea is to shift from being partial to being symmetrical, to address sin biblically for everyone. This honors the moral agency of all members and, most importantly, it shifts the ultimate goal back to pursuing the holiness of the entire flock. At the end of the day, the entire argument is framed as an act of love. The source concludes that true pastoral care, real love for people, doesn't mean creating a comfortable space where sin gets a free pass. It means being willing to call out the disease in all its forms so that healing can actually begin. Which leaves us with this final and I think crucial question. If we accept the premise that love really does require accountability, what's the real cost of applying it unequally? What does a community or a family or an individual truly lose when half its members are just left to stagnate spiritually? It's a heavy question, but one that's absolutely worth thinking about.